Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? An impending patchwork of artificial intelligence laws across the U.S. will make it challenging for employers to comply and understand whether compliance is required in the first instance. California, whose laws and regulations often create a veritable minefield for employers, may be next by defining AI, requiring more transparency, and imposing other safety, testing, reporting, and enforcement standards. On this episode of our AI podcast series, We Get AI for Work, we discuss California's proposed comprehensive AI legislation and its potential impact. Today's hosts are Eric Felsberg and Joe Lazzarati, principals and leaders of the firm's AI services group. Joining Eric and Joe on this episode is special guest Scott Jang, principal in Jackson Lewis's San Francisco office and co-leader of the firm's technology group. Eric, Joe, and Scott, given California's significance to the entertainment industry and as the global hub for technology and innovation, the question on everyone's mind today is, how could California's AI legislation provide effective safeguards without stifling creativity and innovation? And how does that impact my organization?
Thank you, Alicia, and hi, everyone, and welcome back to our new podcast dedicated to the issue of AI in the workplace. My name is Eric Felsberg, and I'm joined by my partner, Joe Lazzarati. How's it going, Joe?
Hey, Eric. How are you?
Doing well. Hey, so Joe, we've been seeing a lot of activity coming out of California as it relates to AI. And I know whenever we talk about anything having to do with California, we like to consult with one of our California partners. And so, I'm happy to say that today we're joined by our partner, Scott Jang. Scott is a principal in our San Francisco office. And why don't you say hello, Scott?
Hey, everyone. Hey, Eric. Hey, Joe. How's it going?
Good. Well, Scott, thank you for joining us. Like I said, whenever the topic of anything having to do with California comes up, we like to have one of our California partners join. And this is no different. I mean, we are seeing a lot of activity coming out of California as it relates specifically to the topic of AI. So, Scott, before we get into some of the specific legislation and questions that I think Joe and by extension our listeners have, can you provide a little bit of history and context to where we find ourselves as it relates to AI in California?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a good starting point when it comes to California, because although legislation is currently before Governor Newsom this year, the legislative efforts and focus on AI has started as early as last year. And as some of our listeners may recall, there were actually some bills that were working through the California legislature already back in 2023, having to do with adopting safety measures with respect to AI. Now, in 2023, those bills ultimately did not make their way to Governor Newsom's desk because Governor Newsom had expressed some concern that California was developing kind of a patchwork of legislation to deal with AI, and he wanted to address the topic in a more systemic, unified manner. So the legislature ultimately did not pass those bills and put them before Governor Newsom back in 2023. But we're here at it again, and there have been a raft of bills and legislation posed to Governor Newsom, are pending before him for signature, and frankly, may be signed in about a couple of days or so, because Governor Newsom has until September 30th to sign those bills.
Great. It's interesting. You mentioned the patchwork. I know, a lot of the clients that we work with that are confronting these issues. One of the things that they constantly confront is a very simple topic, which is, what is the definition of AI, right? Each one of these laws around the country kind of define AI a little bit differently, right? Across jurisdictions. So if you're an employer who's trying to, you have national operations and you're trying to comply with all these different laws, it's exactly that. It's a patchwork, and it makes it challenging for employers to even understand whether they're subject to some of these laws. And to determine that, you really need to understand how a particular jurisdiction defines AI, and then determine, once you know that definition, whether your tool, your platform that you're interested in falls under that definition. And the reason I mention that is one of the laws, Scott, as you know, or a bill, I should say, at this point, is targeted at defining AI, at least for purposes of certain California laws, right? And I think this is actually a very good move on behalf of the state, right, to kind of level the playing field, define it for everybody so that we all understand exactly what it is the state intends when it mentions AI and some of these other laws. So, Scott, can you talk a little bit about kind of that effort that is underway out in California to define AI, and maybe talk a little bit about how, at least right now, they're intending to define it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually touches base on, I know, a discussion that we've had many times, Eric, and that is AI in the last couple of years has almost become a buzzword that everyone says and has a general sense of. But when we get into the specifics, especially when it comes to legislative efforts at addressing AI, people can be talking about very different things. For example, are we talking about, big data systems? Are we talking about generative AI? What exactly are we talking about? And as you can imagine, from a legislative standpoint, it's pretty important to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing before we're going to legislate the issue. And that is also important because one of the concerns that has been consistently raised to Governor Newsom is kind of this balance between setting a framework for developing AI technology in the future that makes practical sense, while also leaving enough flexibility for those in this space to be acting with enough ingenuity and creativity that would maximize the utility of this technology. So with that said, California has actually taken a potential step at this definitional aspect of creating a framework for legislating AI. And that finds its form in AB 2885, which passed this California Assembly and is before Governor Newsom right now. And AB 2885 does a couple things. One of it creates a definition with respect to artificial intelligence, which it defines as an engineered or machine-based system that varies in its level of autonomy and that can, for explicit or implicit objectives, infer from the input it receives how to generate outputs that can influence physical or virtual environments. Now, a lot of words, it sounds very technical, but I think it still underlines the point that we raised earlier, and that is we need a basis for everyone to understand what exactly is meant by artificial intelligence, and this hopefully does exactly that. Now, AB 2885 also includes other aspects, such as requiring the state agencies to develop an inventory of how currently AI systems may already be implemented or being used by the government, as well as developing studies in terms of framework in how to legislate AI in the future. And so hopefully this is a building block piece of legislation that California, as well as potentially other states, can look at with respect to how do we move forward with AI in the future.
Thanks, Scott. Joe?
Well, it was interesting for me in looking at some of the bills that are running through the California legislature now, going before the governor, is state's effort to increase transparency in terms of the disclosures that developers, and kind of going back to this definitional issue that you and Scott were talking about, right? AB 2013, for example, provides a laundry list of things that have to be kind of disclosed for a developer that's developing an artificial intelligence, a generative artificial intelligence system or service. And what is a developer? Is it just a company that's selling a service? Is it a company that's developing something internally? Like, how does that apply? Who will it apply to? Under what circumstance? I think that may be a question for organizations. But this idea of transparency, is pretty important, particularly as concerns about deepfakes and other types of uses of generative AI become more prolific. Over the weekend, I was watching, I guess Oprah Winfrey had a special on, I think it was ABC. It's pretty interesting. She interviewed Sam Altman. She interviewed a bunch of people, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go look at it. It was pretty interesting discussions with a lot of different people in the AI space, and she was kind of amazed at some of the technology and also a little bit nervous about it. And it seems like not just California, but other states are approaching this issue of deepfakes and generative AI technology a little bit differently. Like Texas has, Tennessee rather has I think they're calling it the Elvis law, to try to prohibit the use of someone's image, right, without their consent for a commercial purpose. So you're seeing some states approach it that way. At least these laws in California seem to be approaching it, at least in part, from the standpoint of making certain disclosures about how they train their system, or what steps they take to develop their tool. SB 942, which I think, as I understand it, applies to much larger organizations that would be considered covered providers under the statute. Like organizations that have like 1 million monthly visitors or users to their system, having to be more transparent, and even requiring them to have a tool that can help a person determine is this some kind of a deep fake that was developed by a generative AI system. So this whole notion of transparency, I think, is working its way through not just California's legislature, but in other states as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I agree with you, Joe. I think your point about the focus on transparency is a good one to point out to our listeners, because it does kind of circle back to that point that I raised earlier, and that is, when legislating AI and AI in the future, this delicate balance between creating a framework for the safe use of AI, but not stifling the industry with restrictions and rules that may not even be relevant 2 years from now. And so I think what you see, especially in this latest round of California proposed legislation, is a focus on just disclosure and transparency, as opposed to substantive restrictions on certain types of AI. And so, as to your point, SB 942 goes into a requirement that certain quote unquote covered providers create a tool in which the public can detect AI, and whenever text, video, or other multimedia content is created with generative AI, as well as a requirement that the cover provider actually make that disclosure. And so I think that the Taylor Swifts and the Swifties of the world may have a better sense of when generative AI content is being used and is being floated in the public domain. And so that seems to be an area of focus for California, definitely.
Yeah. One other thing interesting to get Scott and Eric, you guys to just your comments on. I know some of our clients sometimes will get either an employee providing it for some purpose, a document or photo or video, or maybe in the course of litigation, in discovery, they may get a document. So, we're talking about Taylor Swift and Oprah Winfrey, but when the rubber hits the road for us, it may not be as glamorous. It may just be a document and saying, well, is this real or not? And so there's a real practical issue as to how we determine that, and can we rely on that at this point? And at least from what I know, the resources to do that are somewhat sparse at this point.
Yeah, I have to say, on a couple of litigation matters, I have run into circumstances where clients have believed that text messages or photos may have been fixed or manipulated. And while there is some forensics that can be done with respect to those types of manipulated media, I anticipate with the growing use of generative AI in the public sphere that the level of sophistication of the manipulation is going to only increase. And I'm not sure whether or not, the forensic tools that currently are at our disposal necessarily are going to be sophisticated enough to go and match and detect some of the more creative versions of generative AI that might come across our desks.
Yeah, well, certainly a lot to think about. Scott, we want to thank you very much for being available to us and kind of educating us on what is going on in California. We appreciate it, and we hope that you'll keep us updated so that we can keep our listeners updated as to what's going on in California. And I'm sure we'll see a lot of similar efforts across the country thereafter. So, Joe, Scott, any last comments before we break?
I would only add that we're definitely looking, as we mentioned on a prior episode, if listeners have any thoughts or suggestions or want to comment on these podcasts, you can reach out to us through our email address, ai@jacksonlewis.com.
And just for me, just for our listeners to put September 30th on their calendar, that's when the governor has his last day to sign these bills as well as other legislation in California. And so we'll have a better sense of the extent that California pushes forward with its legislation on AI.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, all of you.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.